I am Atlas the Fox, and this is the story of how 60 million buffalo were killed across the Great Plains of America. Not for food, not for survival, but to break the people who depended on them. In 1800, the Great Plains of North America were alive with thunder. Not thunder from the sky, thunder from the ground. 60 million bison moved across the grasslands, from the Gulf of Mexico to Canada, from the Rocky Mountains to the Mississippi River. Their herds were so vast, the plains seemed alive. A sea of animals, stretching from horizon to horizon. The ground trembled beneath their hooves, the air filled with dust. For thousands of years, the indigenous peoples of the Great Plains lived alongside them. The Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho, the Comanche, the Crow. To them, the buffalo was more than food. It was shelter, clothing, tools, medicine. It was life itself. Every part of the animal was used. Nothing was wasted. Buffalo hide became the walls of teepees. Bones became tools. Sinew became bowstrings. Dung became fuel. One animal could sustain a family for weeks. Where the buffalo flourished, the people flourished. This relationship had endured for countless generations. Then, in the span of just a few decades, almost all of it ended. Not by accident, not by drought, not by disease, but by decision. A cold, calculated decision made in government offices far from the plains. By 1885, 60 million animals had become fewer than 600. One of the greatest wildlife populations on Earth had collapsed into a handful of survivors. And while some people called it progress, for others, it was the end of a world. This is the story of the American buffalo and how its destruction helped bring an end to the civilizations of the Great Plains. In 1492, Christopher Columbus reached the shores of the Americas. Believing he had discovered a western route to India, he gave a name to the people he encountered: Indians. This name would remain for centuries. To European eyes, this marked the beginning of civilization in a new world. But for the indigenous peoples of the Americas, it marked the beginning of catastrophe. The fate of millions began to change the moment the Santa Maria reached the Caribbean, and Columbus's crew erected the cross that would later become known as the Cruz de la Para. For centuries, European settlers pushed westward across North America. The movement was driven by a powerful idea: manifest destiny. The belief that Americans were destined to expand across the continent from coast to coast, regardless of who already lived there. As settlers moved west, they entered lands occupied by indigenous nations for generations. At first, the United States government attempted to manage the conflict through treaties. In 1851, representatives of several Plains nations signed the first Fort Laramie Treaty. The agreement recognized indigenous control over vast territories across the Great Plains and promised protection from encroaching settlers. The promises did not last. Settlers kept moving west. Roads crossed indigenous territory. Military forts appeared where they had not been invited. Tensions rose. Among those who resisted was Red Cloud, an Oglala Lakota leader. When the United States attempted to establish military routes through Lakota lands, Red Cloud fought back. His warriors attacked forts, supply lines, and military patrols. In December 1866, they destroyed an entire detachment of 80 U.S. soldiers. Not one survived. It became one of the worst defeats the United States Army had suffered on the plains. The government was forced to negotiate. In 1868, a second Fort Laramie treaty guaranteed the Great Sioux Reservation and recognized Sioux control over the sacred Black Hills. The treaty promised the land for the Sioux absolute and undisturbed use and occupancy. But like so many promises before it, this one would soon be broken. In 1874, gold was discovered in the Black Hills. Thousands of prospectors flooded into Sioux territory. The treaty was ignored. The government did little to stop the invasion. A promise written on paper proved less valuable than the gold beneath the ground. The Sioux resisted. In June 1876, Lakota and Cheyenne warriors, led by Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, confronted Lieutenant Colonel George Custer near the Little Bighorn River. The battle ended in a major defeat for the United States Army. More than 200 soldiers were killed. Custer himself died on the battlefield. It was the greatest military victory ever achieved by the Plains peoples. But while generals planned campaigns and chiefs prepared for war, another battle was already being lost. Not on the battlefield, but across the grasslands themselves. The buffalo were disappearing, and without them, even the greatest victory could not last. The destruction of the buffalo was not caused by a single event. It happened when technology, money, expansion, and policy came together at the same moment. First came the railroads. They did not just cross the Great Plains, they opened them. What had once been distant buffalo country was suddenly connected to eastern markets. Settlers could move west faster. Hunters could travel deeper. Hides, bones, and meat could be shipped out in enormous quantities. The railroad turned the slaughter from scattered hunting into mass killing on an industrial scale. A skilled hunter could kill hundreds of animals in a single day. Passengers sometimes shot bison from train windows for entertainment. The carcasses were stripped. The rest was abandoned to rot beneath the sun. Between 1872 and 1874 alone, more than 4 million buffalo were killed. The destruction shocked even some contemporary observers, but many military leaders saw opportunity. Colonel Richard Irving Dodge expressed the logic openly. Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone. The reasoning was brutally simple. The indigenous peoples of the Great Plains depended on the buffalo. Destroy the buffalo, and resistance would collapse. The destruction was no longer simply tolerated, it was becoming policy. In 1874, Congress considered legislation that would have protected the remaining southern buffalo herds, but President Ulysses S. Grant refused to sign it. The hunters kept shooting. The railroads kept expanding. The carcasses kept piling up across the plains. Every year, the herds grew smaller. Every year, resistance grew weaker. Without the buffalo, entire communities faced starvation. The food supply disappeared. Trade networks collapsed. Families became dependent on government rations. The buffalo had sustained freedom. Now their absence created dependence. Resistance became increasingly impossible. Sitting Bull fled to Canada. Crazy Horse surrendered in 1877. He was killed later that same year. Across the plains, indigenous nations were forced onto reservations. Traditional ways of life were shattered. Government food often arrived late. Sometimes it never arrived at all. Children were removed from their families and sent to boarding schools. The goal was assimilation. The buffalo were gone. The resistance was broken. The reservations were full. The Plains Wars were effectively over. In 1892, a photograph was taken outside the Michigan Carbon Works. It showed a mountain of buffalo skulls stacked higher than the men standing beside them. The image has become one of the most haunting photographs in American history. It was not a photograph of a hunt. It was a photograph of a civilization disappearing. The remains of the buffalo found a new market. Their bones were collected by the ton and shipped east. They were turned into fertilizer and industrial products. Not even dust left. By 1885, only around 600 bison remained in North America. From 60 million to 600 in less than 50 years. The buffalo were not simply victims of progress. They became targets because they stood between indigenous people and those who wanted their land. But the United States had not just conquered territory. It had destroyed the system that made indigenous freedom possible. That is why the photograph of buffalo skulls matters. It shows what was lost. Not just animals, not just bones, but the foundation of an entire way of life. 60 million buffalo disappeared, and with them disappeared the last real barrier between the United States government and the conquest of the Great Plains. Hi, I am Atlas the Fox. If you want more stories from history, subscribe and follow me into the next episode.